Well, this is the Advent season, which is the 4 weeks before Christmas, the 4 Sundays before Christmas. So it kind of changes a little bit from year to year, but we're not going to do anything with Advent. How about that? Today's the Sunday of joy, so please be joyful, but we're not going to talk about joy, we're going to talk about faith. I had planned on talking about joy, but early this morning, I felt that God was taking us a different direction, so that's what we're going to do. Sound good to you? Yeah. Good deal. Well, my name's Jared Bouton, and thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be with you today. To be honest, I had no idea where your church was. I'd never been here. I've known Dawn for about 6 months, and gotten to know her really well, and we worked together. And got to meet her family, and if you all are anything like them, I know that this is a great place and y'all really love Jesus, so I'm happy to be here this morning. So as I said, we're going to take a break from talking about kind of the traditional Advent topic that would be this Sunday, on Gaudete Sunday or the Sunday of Joy, and talk about faith. It's actually a story that we're going to look at here in Scripture in Luke chapter 7. So if you want to go to Luke chapter 7, that's where we're going to end up. But it's a story about a soldier. And we're going to talk about just looking into this story this morning. We have the 4 Sundays of Advent, with hope and peace and joy and love. And all of those are wonderful things to look at, but something that is really important that kind of helps us access all of those is our faith. Putting our faith in Jesus makes all of those other these traditional topics of Advent really come alive. And so, like I said, Luke chapter 7, we're going to look at the first 10 verses there. There's so much in this story. And so I want to dig into that. But before we do that, I want to talk about where we are in the greater story of Jesus, right? Oftentimes this time of year, we talk a lot about Jesus and his birth and his early time frame of life. But as the story plays out, right, where does this story find itself in the greater story of God? Okay, so we're in Luke, the book of Luke. A little bit about Luke. For you, he was a physician. He was a doctor. It's said that he was a Syrian from Antioch. Okay, so he's not Jewish. Okay, that's important. Luke was not a disciple of Jesus. Like I said, he's not even Jewish, but he was a Gentile disciple of the apostles, who later became a disciple of Paul and even traveled with Paul. He even went on some of Paul's missionary journeys with him as his personal doctor, concierge, confidant, friend, and fellow minister of the gospel. Luke writes this gospel, this story, in having the whole world in mind as the audience. Okay, that's important for you this morning. He writes this in mind for thinking about Jewish people as well as non-Jewish people or Gentiles. That's probably most of you, I'm guessing. Luke's gospel specifically connects to the inclusion of the Gentiles in the salvation of Jesus, as well as those who are Jewish, also those who are outcasts in society, like lepers, tax collectors, sinners, women, slaves. Those are all specifically mentioned in the book of Luke. Luke gives an account on the birth of John the Baptist, and then Jesus' birth, and then a few other stories before establishing his 12 apostles, the 12 apostles or the 12 disciples. Then Jesus preaches what is known on the Sermon on the Plain, and he retreats to a little fishing village on the coast of the Sea of Galilee called Capernaum. Capernaum is just on the northern side of the Sea of Galilee, or depending on the version or where you find this body of water in the New Testament, it might be called the Sea of Tiberias or Lake Gennesaret. The Sea of Galilee, Lake Gennesaret, the Sea of Tiberias, those are all three the same body of water. And Capernaum is on the very northern portion of this. And this is where our story picks up this morning. This is where it begins here in Luke chapter 7. Jesus comes back into town, and he's approached by some Jewish elders of the community. Okay, so let's take a look at that story. Again, we're going to read the first 10 verses of chapter 7. It says, when Jesus had finished saying all of this in the hearing of the people, again, talking about the Sermon on the Plain that he had just given, he entered Capernaum. There, a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." This is the Jewish elders talking about the centurion here. So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to him to say, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I do not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. That one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following him, he said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith, even in all of Israel." Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. See, Jesus comes back into town, and in thinking about Capernaum, this is a kind of a no-name little spot. I mean, it's really in the middle of nowhere. It was a really small village, even for thinking about that time frame. Jesus was from where? Where was Jesus born? Where did he grow up? Anybody? He's born in Bethlehem. Grew up where? Nazareth. Yeah, his parents live in Nazareth. Nazareth was even smaller of a community, but out in the middle of nowhere. You wouldn't go to Nazareth unless you were on purpose going to Nazareth, kind of like coming out here to the church, right? Yeah. So this is where Jesus grows up. But when he grows up, he begins his ministry. And he begins his ministry where? In Galilee, kind of the northern plain area of Israel. And the Sea of Galilee, or Lake Gennesaret, is there. And there's lots of life. We heard about the tree that became the boat. That story takes place on the Sea of Galilee when Jesus calms the storm. And there's this little village on the very northern edge of the lake, Capernaum. It doesn't exist anymore. There's some rubble there, but it's not an active community at this point in time. But this is where Peter married into a family, and his mother-in-law has a home. Okay, and so this is kind of this becomes base camp for Jesus and the disciples in his ministry. They basically live with Peter's mother-in-law there in the home, and they go back and forth, and they travel obviously quite a bit. The New Testament, Jesus' story is kind of all over the place in Israel, but their base camp is in Capernaum. So this is where we are, right? Jesus is coming back into town. And they had welcomed him here to this town. The city of Capernaum, the village of Capernaum, had welcomed Jesus and his disciples. And so he's coming back into town, and he's approached by some Jewish elders of the community, which would know Jesus because he was a rabbi. He would teach in the synagogue. Jesus then, he's coming into town, and he's approached by these elders, and they've been sent specifically by the centurion to Jesus to plead with him to come and heal his servant who's ill. Okay, again, Capernaum is a city that's positively portrayed by Luke throughout the gospel. And it's a city that welcomes Jesus, embraced Jesus. The Jewish elders coming to Jesus are in stark contrast to the Jewish elders who ran Jesus out of his hometown, Nazareth. And if we look back, that's just a few chapters ago. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus preaches, he teaches in the synagogue, and the Jewish elders there in his hometown of Nazareth run him out to a mountainside and attempt to kill him. But these Jewish elders come to him on behalf of the centurion. Verses 4 and 5, it says, the Jewish elders say this to Jesus about the centurion: "This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." How many times in the Bible do we see Jews stand up and plead on behalf of Romans? Not very many. This shows the type of man that the centurion really was. We don't really have a modern day equivalent to a centurion of biblical Roman proportions. In all my research, I learned that it really was more of a earned, battle-proven status, not necessarily a rank. The centurion, however, would be in charge of many soldiers, closely related to a modern-day major, because he was tough, loyal, proven, respected by the other soldiers. In this story, even the Jewish people, even the Hebrews, those under his oppression, highly esteemed and respected him and his character. This is our first encounter in Luke of faithfulness outside of the Jewish community. In fact, it's the first time we see anyone with exemplary faith in the Gospel of Luke. This marks the beginning of the broadening of Jesus' ministry to include the Gentile world and those in Jewish culture who are also social outcasts. Now, this is important to us today because, see, Luke is marking a turning point with this story that ultimately starts the dialogue that allows for us to understand that we too, as non-Jewish people, as Gentile people, are included in the salvation of Jesus. The salvation of Jesus is all-inclusive, it's all-encompassing, it's primary and solitary in the saving of the world. And Luke begins to make that clear with this story. Jesus' sacrifice was for everyone. This is exciting, right? I'm excited about it. We can learn a lot from this centurion. From the story, we know that the servant here that is sick, the way that the servant is described, it uses a Greek word called entimos. And this means that the servant is valued or precious or highly regarded by his master, by the centurion. This shows the importance of the servant to his master. And even in this time of duress, the first thing that we can learn from the centurion is his faith was without uncertainty. He did not need to see to believe. He just simply believed. The centurion is also humble and trusting in the Lord. He didn't even come to Jesus himself. And this was because he was showing utter trust and belief that Jesus didn't even need to come and be bothered. He didn't need to take time out of his day. Jesus needed to just say the word, and his servant would be healed. Additionally, in Jewish culture, it would have made Jesus unclean to have physical contact with this sick person, or even be in a Gentile home. Luke uses this story to begin to really deconstruct the concept of ritual purity being linked to personal salvation. This centurion, who by nature is unclean himself, is asking Jesus to come and heal a sick person, another ritualistic unclean person, yet has a true inner purity, really, not yet displayed by any other person other than Jesus so far in the gospel story of Luke. See, at first when I read this, when I look at this, I think the centurion, well, you know, how pretentious he's being, right? How arrogant he's being. He won't even come to Jesus himself. Jesus, hey, come and do this for me. But as we look at this and really understand that the centurion, who probably doesn't have any of these Jewish ritualistic things ingrained, this culture ingrained, this religion ingrained in who he is showing respect to Jesus by allowing him to do an act, to show up, but yet not have to make himself unclean according to his culture, his religion, and his understanding. So Jesus is met by the Jewish elders on the outside, the outskirts of Capernaum, and they ask him to come. They tell him the story. Jesus goes with them. They're approaching the house. Jesus sees what's happening, and he actually sends other men out to go and see Jesus, right? It says he sends his friends. Verse 6, so Jesus went with them, meaning the Jewish elders. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to him to say, Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. See, again, the centurion was attempting to allow Jesus to stay within his religious boundary. Now, we know Jesus blew that up, right? We know he went beyond those boundaries. He broke down those walls. He kind of set a new standard for us. But the centurion doesn't know that's happening, right? The centurion isn't going to do that on his own. He's providing a way for Jesus to do what Jesus does, but yet at the same time, stay within his religious boundary. But as usual, right, Jesus breaks down that door and shows us that who we are to the world around us doesn't matter to him at all. He came to save us, right? He came to save all of us. A third and fourth thing that we can learn from the centurion is that he was a compassionate man, and that was even for the marginalized. I mean, this story is about his sick slave, after all, right? The centurion was a man of power, yet he was concerned with, culturally, what would be one of the lowest forms of life around him. Verse 8, for myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me, the centurion says. I tell this one, go, and he goes. I tell this one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. See, the centurion is saying to Jesus, I understand what it is to have power. Yet I believe you have power far greater than me. Verse 7, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. See, he believed. He trusted. The centurion's faith was also founded in his belief in Jesus as Lord. His faith rested directly on God rather than a set of ideas or plans or behaviors or rituals or even specific religion. Verses 9 and 10. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following him, he said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in all of Israel. And then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. Two things I want to point out to you from those two verses. The first one is there's that little phrase in there that right before Jesus says what he has to say, he says this little phrase. And if you're reading the NIV, it says, I tell you, or sometimes it'll elaborate and say, I tell you the truth. If you pay attention as you're reading the New Testament, this is something that comes up quite a bit. Jesus says this a lot. And it's linked to a specific word in Greek that is basically a big blinking marquee sign, okay? So anytime Jesus says, I tell you, or I tell you the truth, or if you're reading a King James Version, it'll say, verily, verily, I say unto you, right? Anytime that phrase is mentioned, it's like this, again, this big blinking marquee that says, pay attention, listen, this is important. Okay, so Jesus makes that statement, and then he says what he has to say. He says, I have not found such great faith even in all of Israel. Again, Luke linking our story, right? The story of the entire world into the story of salvation. See, it's not just for Jewish people. It's not just for Israel. It's not just for the Hebrews. Jesus came to save us all. So make a mark in that. I don't know if you mark in your Bible, you highlight, you underline, you make a note on your phone, whatever, but take note of that. Anytime it says, I tell you, or I tell you the truth, or verily, verily, I say unto you, that's worth highlighting right there. Jesus is wanting you to pay attention to those exact words. The second thing is, I want you to think about this. How many times in the Bible does it say that Jesus was amazed? See, this is a time that someone is healed because of the faith of another person. Did you catch that? It wasn't the servant that was asking to be healed. It wasn't the slave. It wasn't him that sent a note or sent a friend or paid somebody off to get to Jesus. It was somebody else's faith that was making that request on his behalf. Luke tells us in chapter 5 about a paralyzed man who was healed because of his faith of his friends. And that story, there's 4 friends, and they climb up on a roof, and they can't get to Jesus. And this also takes place in Capernaum, and it's Peter's mother-in-law's house that this happens in. But they go there, and there's so many people packed in, they can't get to Jesus. So they climb on top, and they tear back the roof, and they lower this man down on a map with ropes right in front of Jesus. And because of that, he heals this man. And the man gets up and he walks away. Never walked in his life. And Jesus says then too, that happened because of the faith of your 4 friends. Another time that Jesus was amazed. In fact, those are the only times that it specifically says Jesus was amazed. And it had to do with faith. It had to do with belief. It had to do with trusting in God so much. You didn't have to see it to believe it. You just trusted. You just had faith. There's a song. I really like this song. We didn't sing it today, but it's some of the lyrics go like this. You may recognize the song. It came out about 10 years ago. But it says, there's a part of the bridge where it says, "Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters, wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith will be made stronger in the presence of my Savior." See, this story this morning and that we get in Luke chapter 7 and the lyrics of this song, really call to us to put our faith directly on Jesus. Not the rituals that our society or culture before us has defined for us of things that we should do. Not traditions of things that we should chase after, or things that tradition can be good. It helps point us to a particular direction, right? It helps create this Advent, for example, creates this arrow that points toward December 25th, the celebration of Jesus' life. It's incredible. It's great. It's wonderful to pay attention to. But we need to put our faith directly on Jesus, not the process of Advent, not the tradition of Advent, and all of those other things that we as human beings have defined and created for ourselves to create this avenue or this effort to put our faith on Jesus, right? That's the point, that we put our faith directly on Him. No matter what. Regardless of what happens in life. No matter what life is dealing to you right now. No matter how hard things are. No matter what the people around you are doing. Regardless of your job, regardless of what your friends are doing, regardless of what your family is saying, no matter what, we put our faith on Him. That we put our faith on the one, right? The only. That we put our faith in Christ alone. This is what God asks of us to do. Recently somebody challenged me to think through something. And they asked me, it was a conversation that I was a part of, and we were talking about a lot of different things, but the question came up that if my church, right, the church that I belong to, If my church closed tomorrow, would anybody miss it?
I would miss
I'm glad, buddy. I'm glad.
it. You would miss it too, Dad.
You're right. But I think that's important. That's something for you to think about. That's important. It's something good for us all to think about, right? Does the church have an impact? Would the community, would people around us miss it? I think that the argument could be made that the answer, and I'm not going to answer this for you, okay? This is a question for you. But I'm going to say a few things to help you process through this question, okay? I think the argument could be made that the answer is that some would notice, right? Some would miss it. Some would feel that there was a missing piece of the puzzle. But I think the argument could also be made that some might not even know. I do know, I said that I'd never been here, but I do know some of the history of your church. As I walked in the door, it said that this church was started in 1855. There aren't a lot of things that are around for that long, and most of them that are worthwhile. I do know that God has allowed this place and the people who gather here to have a great impact on some people. To have a great impact for the kingdom. But I believe this is something for us to consider, right? Something for us to think through as a community of believers together. Why does our church exist, right? Does the church exist for the people who attend? Does the church exist to reach others in the surrounding area? Does the church exist to make us feel good about filling the religion void in our lives? Does it exist for us? Does it exist for Jesus? Now, again, hear me. I'm not implying anything to you this morning. I'm asking you to think about these questions in a real way. Because the truth is, I could take a stab at answering these questions. You probably could too. But the reality is, whatever Jesus would say, whatever his answers would be, that's what we need to be paying attention to this morning. The challenge for you today is to fully put your faith in the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, to allow him to move in the ways that he wants. That is the best possible, most possible way that we could be, the most relevant that we could ever be. It's not really something that we'll do. It's not something that we'll accomplish, but we must look to Jesus. We must fully trust in him and be willing to go where he wants to go and do what he wants to do. Fully put our faith on him. This story in Luke about this centurion models for us to humbly come before the Lord, to have compassion for the needs of others, to have an openness to the marginalized in our community, and have an outstanding faith that leaves Jesus amazed. I believe and I pray that God would do something with my life, with your church, that makes an incredible mark on the history of Shelby County. But no matter what happens, I'll trust him. I'll put my faith in him. I'm challenging you to do the same this morning.